Were you born and raised here in Eugene?
I was born in Eugene when the town was probably 10,000. And my father was a professor of geology at the University of Oregon. And then I spent 2 years in the Philippines. My father went over there with the first group of people attached to the Bureau of Science and was head of the science of the mining division, and did that for 10 years, came back to the university, then when asked to go out again for 2 more years, and that's when I went as a child. And so I went through University High School here and University of Oregon, played basketball and baseball at Oregon. Not a big time star, but I played. And then I first joined the V7 program in my junior year because the war was brewing, and at the end of that year we were given the option of staying and graduating or going into service. And so I decided to get out, and then in my senior year the Marine Corps came along, and I had thought the Pacific was going to be the problem. My father had written a number of articles on the fact that the Japanese were stockpiling 10 times what they needed, and of course they were getting involved in China. And so I joined the Marine Corps, and it was a good experience for me. And of course after the war I went to Michigan, got a master's in education with a minor in public health. They have a public health school there. And then I taught at Lewis and Clark College for 16 years, coached every sport including the women's swimming team, and then decided to get my doctorate and went to Stanford and studied under a physician there. And then in 1963 I returned to the University of Oregon, and I taught here until I retired in 1985. Then they permitted us to teach another 5 years before they kicked us out entirely. And so I had moved into the health field, so my field of what I thought was my best field was international public health. And a lot of it interest traced back to my experience in the Marine Corps, getting involved with malaria and filariasis and diarrhea and seeing leprosy cases. And so that's kind of the direction that. So in our international studies program I taught a course on world health problems. It was one of the elective courses. So that's about it. I have a wife and 2 children and 3 grandchildren. So I don't know how much more you need to know. I mentioned my son retired from the Army Dental Corps, and my daughter's been flying for Pan Am and United for 28 years. So that's one thing that got me around the world a lot, and so I was able to take lots of slides and visit a lot of countries, and that helped me professionally.
Is she a pilot, your daughter?
No, she's a flight attendant.
Flight attendant.
Yeah, yeah.
There's a friend of mine right now who teaches over at Lewis and Clark.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, a good friend of mine.
Let's see.
There's Sean Cassidy. It's I'm not sure exactly what the program's called, but it has to do with film and video. This stuff.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, he's been over there probably about. he's tenured now, so however long it takes to get tenured, that's how long he's been there, plus
Kind
a
of
year or something.
varies. I left in '63. Some of my people are still there, but most of them are not.
In fact, he,
No? Where were you when Pearl Harbor happened, and how did you feel about that?
Well, I was on, it was over the weekend, I was on leave, and I was in a hotel lobby in Washington, D.C., because our class, we were the 3rd candidates class in the 6th RLC, and we were commissioned before Pearl Harbor. And I was up there on leave, and I heard this broadcast come over this loudspeaker system in the lobby, and that's where I was. And certainly was a shock. And they told all of us to return to our bases. And so I got in my car and hustled back to Quantico, and then they shortened our training period because of that. And a number of my classmates went right out to the 2nd and the 1st Marines. And I was sent to Air Photo Interpretation School. I apparently had done very well in map reading, and so they sent me to a photo school. And then I was sent out to the 2nd Pioneer Battalion in San Diego, and was with that group. And then when they formed the 3rd Marines Division, I was put in the cadre to develop that one, so I became the commanding officer of the headquarters of service troops and made the R3, or the Operations and Training Officer, for the 3rd.
And what was your rank?
Well, I think when I went out there, I was probably a 2nd lieutenant when I first arrived with the 2nd Division. Then I was promoted to 1st lieutenant when I joined the 3rd. And then I was promoted again to captain, but that was on New Zealand when we went out there. So then I had the unusual experience of being sent to 20th Century Fox to learn how to do camouflage. And we did big stuff, with the nets and the artificial tanks and guns, down to individual camouflage. And that was a good experience, so we really didn't have to use any of the big stuff because the air war was won by our forces, and you didn't have to do much cover-up. But we're awful careful about where we did place supply dumps and hospitals and that kind of thing. But I'm glad we didn't have to go to all that work of all those nets.
why at 20th Century Fox?
Well, they make all kinds of artificial trees and stumps and buildings, and so I think they thought some of this artificial buildings and structures would be important. And I think in many cases it might have in Europe. But with the control of the air that we had in the Pacific, it wasn't that important. But they were good technicians, and it was a good experience. And of course, while I was there, I met lots of people and saw films being made, and that was a nice sideline, so it was a great 3 weeks.
Why don't you give us an idea of what you saw being filmed, and yeah, don't forget the story. We gotta have the story.
Well, I saw them make the Oxbow incident. That was done inside. Very interesting. I saw the one, the pirate show, and I'm trying to think of the name of it now. Well, I did see Jackie Oakey in the Iceland film, but Maureen O'Hara was in a film that, and of course I saw Betty Grable in her film, and I think it was Flying Down to Rio, and of course Chuck Wiper, my friend from Eugene, dropped in, and I took him around to the sets because we could go to these sets, and somebody came along and grabbed the two of us and said, do you want to meet Betty Grable? So we were hauled over there, and she put her arms around us, and we had our pictures taken. And then, of course, I remember as Chuck left, he tried to drive a car in front of one of the starlets to get a date. It didn't work. But it was an interesting time to see some of those films made inside. I mean, the pirate ships were in little pools, miniatures, and they'd start the waves going, and it was really very interesting. So I enjoyed that experience, but I really didn't use it much in the Marine Corps.
Yeah, but that thing with Betty Grable, I bet you boasted about that a time or two.
Well, it appeared on the front, well, no, I don't know whether it was on the front page, but it was on the Register Guard, and then it showed up in the Seattle Times, and I don't know why it was up there. Because they take your names, where's your hometown, and of course I still have it, and most people can't believe it.
It's a great picture.
It is a pretty good picture.
I'll bring it over and show it before I take it and put that. Well, hopefully we'll get the picture, we'll be able to scan it in. Before we go any further, could you talk just a little bit about this photo interpretation school? What kind of things you were looking at, or what kind of photos, how the interpretation process works?
Well, we looked at photos for the whole time I was there, and basically trying to get an idea on the shapes and shadows, so you could orient the picture correctly. The shadows would be right with north and south, and then trying to identify various kinds of things. They had lots of overhead pictures. And so it kind of led to orientation on map reading and development, and then looking at it as a kind of a third dimension picture of buildings, of cars, those kinds of things. And you could get a pretty good idea of a better picture of topography of the land. And that's where I thought maybe there was a mistake at Ewell on not judging the topography right, because you had a convex slope on the west slope, and the east slope that we went in on had a series of very steep, sandy terraces. And I think that could have been seen from the air, and they did study both landing sites. But I'm not sure whether the photo interpreters were that good. But, of course, you can always look back and be a quarterback the next day. But from the air and looking at photos, you can get a pretty good idea of the topography of the land, and discern what kind of environment you're going to deal with. And I think that's important. I think that was a help, particularly in our supply situation.
Did you get an opportunity after you were out in the Pacific to see aerial photos of the places you were headed for, and how did you use them if you did?
No, I was never asked to use my skill if I had any, but lots of maps, and certainly was important in interpreting particular sand and models of landings. You get a better idea of where, because one of my jobs was to place a hospital, particularly in Guam, and I tried to pick a safe place, and it turned out pretty well, except for that Japanese counterattack on 25th, the night of the 25th and 26th. It got all the way down to the hospital. But the Japanese knew where the weak spot was, right along the border of the 21st and the 9th. And it was thinly defended, and they got all the way down there. But maybe that's getting ahead of the story.
That's okay.
Good.
We'll take this as you want to give it to us, not in anything else. I'd heard a story about shell craters and not properly interpreting the photos at the New Britain landing, and then you hear a lot about the photos going into Tarawa. Is that right? And again, a misinterpretation of photos, and so the water depth was misjudged. And I know that our methods improved through the war. That's the basis for that question. So, do you have any comments about either of those? Or?
Well, as far as the question of Tarawa and some of those other areas, I wish they had maybe consulted with Dr. Hobbs from Michigan, who studied the Pacific Islands, because they certainly missed the depth, and whether his information would have helped, but certainly they made a great mistake, and I think the air photo might have given a better indication. Now, when we went into Guam, the first troops went in, they were up to almost their high thighs, almost to the hips. When I went in, it was down to about maybe 10 inches. But that was a tremendous tragedy at Tarawa, to go in up to your neck. But that's something I think the Navy certainly could have done a better job on, but it's easy in hindsight to look back on that.
I think the hardest thing, when I was a young man looking at this, the hardest thing for me was to understand, if the water was so shallow the boats couldn't get to the island, how come it was so deep the guys were up to their necks going in? So,
yeah, those landing craft could have gone right over, it seems. Of course, the Amtraks did go over. I had a lot of good friends, classmates, that were in the 2nd. And if I'd stayed in the 2nd, I would have been in the Pioneer Battalion. I've been right in there. So I think in my epilogue I said it's a good thing I wasn't in the 2nd Pioneer Battalion at that time.
okay, well, let's jump to Bougainville, if you would.
Mm-hmm.
Describe a little bit, Leah, about, you're talking about the service company. What's the role of the service company? What does it do for the unit?
Well, the service troops, that's really would be equivalent to a regiment in infantry, but it includes the service battalion, actually has a graves registration unit, a bakery, and which is very important because they put out a lot of bread. Then there was an ordnance company and the motor transport battalion, and then the hospital, field hospital. And it operated generally as a total unit. Now, when Bougainville came along, they decided with the selection of the point of attack, they should take and attach units from the service battalion that did the supplies and the ordnance and the motor transport and attached them to the regimental combat teams. And so our main control personnel and a bigger bulk of the service troops were left on Guadalcanal initially. And of course, the selection of Empress Augusta Bay and Cape Torquino was an area that was really initially lightly defended and far enough from the 40,000 Japanese that supposedly were on the island and much further south, that they could go in there and set up a perimeter before it could be reinforced. And of course they picked an area that was just loaded with swamps and very heavy jungle growth. So those attached units really didn't function well. It was almost unmanageable at the start. There was particularly supplies were piled all over the beaches, and they're very narrow beaches because you went right into the jungle growth and swamps. And the infantry were having enough trouble just maneuvering through this thick jungle, which I've heard described as the worst in the Pacific, and through that swampy area, particularly where the 3rd Regiment went in. It was a big swamp. And so our senior officers were up there and consulted with the division and decided that we'd have to develop a different plan and get the rest of the troops, service troops, up from Guadalcanal. So we developed a plan, and of the 3 operations, Iwo, Guam, and Bougainville, I think eventually the best supply was achieved in the worst conditions, and that was on Bougainville. So I know I was called up, and I was given 3 days because some landing ship infantry ships were coming in 3 days to pick us up, because I had 400 plus Marines that were up the island closer to Henderson Field, and we were down at Titeri, which was probably a good 8 or 10 miles. And so I was told, outfit them in 3 days. Well, so they gave me 2 Navajo Indian talkers. I took one with me and left one at the main supply dump. Without them, I would have had to go up there and go through all the 400, what they needed in the way of bayonets, rifles, all the gear, drive it back, bring it up again. Well, with the talkers, it was possible to make all that listing, and they would jabber back to Titeri, the main dump, and make one trip instead of a round trip. And so we did outfit them in 3 days. And then we were put on the LSIs and took us up to Bougainville. And then our plan developed where Parada Island was the 5th depot of supplies, and our 3rd Division dump was near the end of the main fighter strip where Pappy Boyington had his Corsairs, that main fighter strip near the beach. And of course the service battalion, as far as handling supplies through that swampy jungle area, in some cases was handled 4 times, because we had to pick it up from Parada, where the main unloading occurred, then to our 3rd dump near the airstrip, And then some of it would go a third time direct to the various units of the 9th and the 3rd and the 21st. But then the fourth one developed when the paratroopers were sent to Hellzapoppin Ridge, and they needed supplies. So we developed a advance dump at Evansville, and it was about 7,000 yards through the swamps. And for 2 days, Evansville dump was behind only the paratroopers. It was ahead of the 21st and 9th Marines as they were making their swing to develop the rest of the perimeter. And of course there was Hellzapoppin Ridge, and then also in the 21st sector was Hill 1000. And so I was sent out there in that first couple days to see about security. So we had only Amtraks. There were no roads. The Numa Trail was just a quagmire, and there hadn't developed any real roads. And so we made all of our trips by Amtrak, and any wounded were brought back on Amtrak. So it was a pretty good swampy area, 7,000 yards. And we went just really basically on a straight line through the back of the 3rd Regiment, and then actually got in front of the 21st and 9th. And it certainly was a good thing that the Japanese didn't make any counterattacks at that time. I don't know what would have happened to us, though we had pretty good security set up. But I did spend a couple of days when we were out ahead, and that's not a pleasant thing. We could hear all this firing on Hellzapoppin Ridge, which was just above us. But I think the supply really went very well. And then we were down to about 1 Amtrak when they got the road through, and which was important. And certainly having the Amtraks turn over some equipment to us certainly made it possible to provide supplies for the paratroopers out there.
Okay. You mentioned Parita Island. I was just curious if I know you weren't in on the assault. They took a lot of fire from Parita Island. Can you tell us a little bit about what that island looked like?
Well, it's not very big, and had some tree growth. The other island was a little smaller. Was it Torquina? Yeah, which they had to clear out. But I came up, this was after those were both secured, and when they found that the supply system was not working. So I have no idea really what went on as far as the combat action there.
Okay. That's fair. Gail, did you want to have something else about Bougainville?
Okay, go ahead.
The jungle growth and swampy area was in the area where they decided they would go in and set the perimeter. But there was a lot of high ground in the back. In fact, there's quite a cliff. In fact, one of the engineer roads went to a road, and I think the chief engineer was fired after this, or was relieved. But that may be just the scuttlebutt we got. But it was surrounded by mountainous terrain, and I think in my book, I think there's some pictures showing that high ground, and certainly Hellzapoppin Ridge and Hill 1000 And then beyond that was the Torquino River, where Ted Baker had his problems when he was caught in that behind the Japanese lines. And beyond that was jungles and hills all the way down to the southern part of the island. Now, Bougainville was the largest of the islands, and also one that through history had headhunters and cannibals. One of the books I've read is The Search for the Golden Chalice, and talk about the eating of people. But and after the war, I understand that I know when Chuck Wiper and Al Tucker went out there, they were not permitted to fly. They wanted to fly over Bougainville again, and they were denied because they were shooting at planes. They really were. One of the big copper mines in the Pacific is on Bougainville.
Tell us about Wait a Minute Vines and those kind of things.
Well, the terrain, there were areas, generally the operation area was fairly low, but surrounded by high ground, but quite a bit of swampland, particularly on the right side as you went in, and that was where the 3rd Regiment was involved quite a bit. And the vines, the jungles were very thick. Even where you weren't in the swamp, you're wading through probably up to your top of your boots in mud, particularly after a rain. And the vines had these sharp, I guess you'd call them briars, that would just grab you. And we call them wait a minute vines, and you just had to kind of cut your way through. And they were not only in the low areas, they extended, I'm sure, up on Hills of Poppin Ridge, though I did not actually go up on Hills of Poppin Ridge. But some of those trails up there were very... So you read in and see people. I'm sure the infantry didn't see people more than 5 or 6 feet ahead of them at times. But I think probably the terrain at Bougainville was probably as extreme as anybody experienced. And of course it's part of New Guinea now, and that's the only other places I can think that's probably worse terrain was Papua New Guinea. And of course there were crocodiles, though I didn't see them there, but I'm sure they seemed to select certain rivers, and that was true on Guadalcanal. You knew which river to go to find the crocodiles. And I don't know how much of a problem. They weren't a problem for us. I know they put nets down so we could swim in the rivers there.
We've heard quite a bit about the fight for the trails, and I think you really already answered the question because of the terrain, but could you just explain why the trails were so important, why that kind of shaped the fighting around the perimeter?
Well, about the only access you had for patrol action and movement was on these trails that were already kind of developed. Initially, the Numa Trail, I'm sure, because if you got off the trails, you had to be cutting your way through brush. So a lot of patrol action, I'm sure, and though I was not with the paratroopers or with the forward units, they were confined a lot to those trails, and of course that was pretty hazardous in a way because that could be defended. So it was a way of access to see where the enemy was, but also was a hazardous route. And to go through the swamps and cut your way through the wait a minute vines, that's pretty slow. So the trails were important, but they're also at high risk.
Good. Before we go somewhere else, was there something else you wanted to comment on about Bougainville that we might not have covered already?
No, the only other thing I could comment on is that when we were on Guadalcanal, our food came from New Zealand, and that was mostly mutton and cow tongue, and occasionally some canned salmon, and of course dehydrated potatoes and eggs. But the first fresh food we had was on Bougainville, and that was a delayed Thanksgiving dinner. And it was complete with fresh turkey, dressing, mashed potatoes, the works. It got out to every outpost. And I think this was one thing that the service battalion did a pretty good job on. And of course, it was nice to have it come in by ship. But it did go through this process of at least 3 to 4 handlings to get out there. And it wasn't quite on Thanksgiving. It was delayed a few days, but everybody did. So I think that was kind of interesting that the first fresh food that reached us really in a long time was actually in combat.
All right, now we're going to talk about Guam.
Okay.
So tell us how you got to Guam and how you got that initially set up and other things.
Well, initially, our division was in reserve for Saipan, and we were not committed, though initially I think we were to have struck Guam about 3 or 4 days later. But that was delayed. We were sent back to Eniwetok, and then we finally moved on. They did some more preparation bombing and firepower on the landing beach, which was selected between Adelup Point and Asan Point. And I did go in on D-Day then. Of course, the initial assault troops went in very early after a tremendous bombing preparation. And our service troops, I went in with an advance party of our service battalion and moved across a reef that was about 75 yards wide, probably 10, 12 inches deep. Though you hustled across it, the boats couldn't go over the reef edge. You could see artillery and mortar geysers all around. And we moved across the main road that went from Agana all the way down to the harbor through the 2 points. And looming ahead was the Chinito Cliffs, and the 9th Marines went in on the right, and they had probably the best terrain, and they moved quite rapidly over the side of the Chinito Cliffs and started working down on the right flank and along the road. I took my unit in straight in across the road and got as close to the cliff as I could behind the 21st Marines. And we dug in because we were to spend the rest of the day and night there. The 21st had a pretty good access up to the top of the Chinito Cliffs. They had a gap that they went through and achieved the first day objective, and so did the 9th Marines. They probably exceeded it. But off to the left, and I could see that as about 500 yards away, that I could observe the 3rd Regiment trying to conquer that cliff. And below the cliff was a very steep slope of grass land, and I could see the infantry assaulting that. and being fatally shot, a lot of machine gun fire. We were in an area where we were occasionally getting some mortar fire, but no small arms fire or machine gun fire. It took 2 days for that 3rd Regiment to achieve what General Smith wanted in the first day. And he was pretty insistent. And I did not think a lot of General Smith pushing those Marines up. Why was it important to try to take that at such a cost? I don't know how many fell there, but the report in the 3rd Division book that I have stated that the losses in the first 2 days by the 3rd Regiment on assaulting that cliff was as high as all the casualties on Bougainville by the whole division. So it was very costly. It was because the cliff came right down to Adelup Point. And well, we spent the night there. There was quite a bit of corrugated iron around, so I had people, as they dug in, to cover up with some of that, because the mortar fire was hitting trees and throwing shrapnel down. And unfortunately, we only had one person got shrapnel in the rear end, and he hadn't put any corrugated iron over his foxhole. So it was mostly harassing fire. Maybe every 5-10 minutes, mortars would come over. But also they were seeking a little bit deeper the road area. And so I think the selection of where we decided to dig in was probably good. I had picked a spot for the division hospital. And it was a well protected area to the right and behind the 9th Marines area. And the next morning we went past it and around a cliff area and established our headquarters there in our initial dump, which we eventually moved probably another 200 yards further on, where we had more room to expand. But I thought I had an excellent place for the hospital because it had a nice kind of a basin area, well protected from artillery and mortar fire. And unfortunately, the commanding officer of the 3rd Medical Battalion was killed on the first day, which raised some questions by other doctors. Should doctors go in on the first or second day? And that's hard to answer. Other people who are killed have mothers and fathers too, and maybe doctors are more important, but that finally simmered down. But the question was, should they be in there? But if you have a field hospital, they're important for the survival of the wounded. And of course, the thing that was probably the most exciting event of the early days was the night of the 25th and the 26th. The Japanese sent approximately 7 battalions against the front line of the 9th and the 21st. And it was about 15 yards of really thinly defended. That was an extreme breadth, and they hit actually the dividing line. And that, of course, can be a weak area. And as it turned out, by the end of that strong counterattack, the front lines, the 21st and the 9th, had killed about 3,200, but all the way in depth, clear down to the front of the division hospital. And I know I got a call that we were being attacked, and by the time I got there with some Marines, they'd already killed about 200, the walking Marines, wounded in the hospital, and hospital personnel. So it got that far. But there were about another 100 that were scattered in the rear area, had gotten clear down to the beach. And I know that we got a call that they had seen a couple near the beach area, and I know I was asked to take a patrol and go after them. And knowing that there are a lot of cliffs around Asan Point, coral cliffs and caves, I took a flamethrower with me. And this was the first experience I had with the Japanese committing harikiri, because we could trace them, we could follow them, they were in a hurry. They went into a cave, and we heard, when we had not rounded where we could look in the cave, 2 explosions that were muffled. And then as we came around, we could see the heads, and I had the flamethrowers blast them. But I'm sure they were probably already dead. That was a choice, many of them, when they had no other option, was to take their own life. And that was my first experience with seeing that, because after examining them, you could see the damage to their belly areas.
How did that strike you?
Well, in a way it was kind of sad. You would expect people to fight back to the end. And I think in many cases most of them did. But for this situation, they elected to take this choice. And maybe because the only thing they had were 2 grenades, because they didn't have any other weapons other than bayonets. So I don't know. But I know from my standpoint, if I was trapped, I would at least try to. And of course, I would like to have taken prisoners. But when you got a cave and you see 2 heads, and you've heard a grenade, a couple of grenades, your first reaction is to, depend on what you've got, and the most lethal thing then in all that cave fighting was a flamethrower. So you kind of hate to do that, to take a life, but it was the first time I was really involved, because in Bougainville we were never involved. It was just heavy artillery and mortars that sailed over mostly to the airstrip. So it was kind of a wake-up call. And of course the next 2 nights, because they expected more infiltrating, because they like to attack at night, we had to establish defense lines above the big dump. Spent 2 nights up there, but nothing happened. They really had apparently pretty well expended themselves.
Let's see, I remember from your book, talking about another patrol action that you participated in on Guam.
Oh, yes. Well, there's one of the a young sergeant, apparently been out by himself. I don't know whether he was looking for souvenirs, but he came into our headquarters and he had a flesh wound. Somebody had shot at him, and almost in the other sector where the brigade came in. So he asked the colonel if he couldn't get some troops and go out there, and so he assigned me to go, and so I picked a couple of good warrant officers. I had one that had a sawed-off Browning automatic gun, and another one that was really experienced. And I took a Jeep, and the sergeant who had been hit by this bullet, he just had a flesh wound across the chest, but not bad. We dressed it, and he guided us out there, and we stopped on some high ground, and I could look down, and there was jungle growth on the left. There was an open grass area, and then jungle growth beyond that. And so I split my patrol. I sent the one warrant officer up above where it was clear ground again, and our idea was to go down because he pointed generally in the area where he thought the shot had come from. And so I sent the warrant officer with the Browning gun, and he was in the first spot. Second spot was a PFC. I was next, and then there were other troops behind me. And so we went down there, and then we were going to make a turn to the left and try to force through that area, see what was there. Well, just as the warrant officer with the best gun moved into the growth on the other side, just before we were going to make a left turn, a rifle shot came out and just missed the man in front of me. He hit the deck, and he wasn't able to do anything. And I just turned in the direction I saw a little movement, and so I emptied 10 of my 15 shots. I had a carbine, and 2 bodies fell and rolled down a bank out of the brushy area. And I emptied the rest of the clip and put in another one. Nobody else apparently was in shape to fire, but this sergeant who had been nicked was creeping up along close underneath a dry creek bed, and he hollered where he was, and I saw where he was, so I told him to throw in a grenade. And the second one, and then the warrant officer called and said, "I'm working around, Captain, can I go in?" And so I let him go in, and then there was a burst of fire because one was trying to get away, but we found 5 in there. So that was kind of another experience. 1 shot by them and 20 by me. But I don't know, the thing I think that helped me in that situation is that when I grew up with a 1-shot 22. And I used to go to Eastern Oregon and ride on the fenders of cars and shoot at jackrabbits on the run. So I was not an expert with the M1, but I was a sharpshooter, but I could shoot offhand at a moving target, and I think that experience maybe was better than all the target shooting I did at the Marine Corps, because I don't know how many I did hit, but I saw 2 of them fall, and I may have injured more. But that was kind of exciting. And of course, the colonel thought I ought to get a Bronze Star, and I told him no. too many officers could get medals, and enlisted men almost had to kill themselves to get a medal, and I said, give it to the sergeant. And also, I thought it was my job, and I didn't think it was that difficult. We had certainly the firepower, we had more than the 5 that ended up in there. We did search the rest of the area and didn't find any more, but so that was probably my big experience.
I recall, also, let's see, after the island was pretty much secured, you were a Jeep and you saw some small kids flag you down.
Yeah, a couple of Chamorro kids. One of them was older than the other one. I was taking a young replacement lieutenant up on a trip up north because it was about at the end. And as we came back, Chamorro kids were excited, and one of them had an M1. I don't know where he got it, but said there were 2 Japanese had gone in the brush, and they were mad because the Japanese had been, because I'd seen some truckload of executed Chamorros earlier, so I think there was a lot of hatred. And so I didn't have my carbine then, I just had a .38 that I carried, and the other lieutenant had a .45, but with the M1 I thought, well, we might see where they've gone. And so we tracked them for about 10 minutes, and they were in a hurry. They were easy to track. They left all kinds of signs, and then suddenly, where you're sitting about 6 feet away, there they were, facing us on the ground. And of course the Chamorro kid, and I was just beside him, he opened up, and so I opened up. But that I didn't particularly like. I'd like to have had a chance maybe to have taken prisoners, but the Chamorro kid wasn't going to. He just reacted, and of course I knew about all the things that the Japanese had done from a standpoint of brutality on the canal and also on Bougainville. And so you really kind of react. But shooting people, they're hidden in the jungle, and you really don't see them as people, but when they are 6 feet away and looking right at you, that's a different story. And I've often thought, what kind of family do they have? So that, of course, we took identification stuff as we did on the 5 back to intelligence, because they like to know what units are they contending with. And as it turned out, they just had some grenades and some bayonets, but no other weapons. So you feel like you had the advantage. And so that wasn't the experience of the patrol of 5 that were killed.
What else about Guam stands out in your mind?
Well, I don't know. When the island was secured, we moved over to the other side of the island. Opposite Agana, and set up camp there. I was sent out on one more patrol, but the island was secured, and I know we spotted 5 Japanese, and couldn't tell whether they're armed or not, but I decided at that point my mission was to go around the dump area, see if there are any access areas for people to come in. I wasn't sent this time to eliminate anybody. So I decided that there'd been enough killing. I saw no reason really to pursue them. They'd eventually probably come out. They'd have to search for food. And I didn't want to risk any of the Marines that I had, because most of them in the service troops were not really infantry trained that much. I mean, you've got a barber and you've got a cook, and I thought enough's enough. We might get bushwhacked somewhere. So I completed my mission, circled the area and spotted the weak areas, and we set up our defense that way. And of course, from then until we went to Iwo is the question of providing recreation for the troops, so we developed a baseball diamond and had a baseball team. So that was the main thing that went on. Then, of course, that was when
Whichever one you care to refer to.
well, of course, we knew about the one that occurred on Guadalcanal before I ever got there, so that where they put out the surrender flag and 20 intelligent people, including the one colonel, went ashore, and then they were mowed down, and then they were gone after with the samurai swords. 2 escaped to tell the story. And of course, there was other ones that involved where they would cut off the emblems, Marine emblems on the arms and stuff them in the mouth. And certainly the book by Bradley about the flags of our fathers, the brutality that occurred on Guadalcanal, where they executed captured Marines with stakes. But that was certainly that was war. The Japanese did not follow the Geneva Conventions. It was a brutal war. In contrast, the European war was almost a gentleman's war, in contrast. But I don't think that the Americans responded. They had a tendency to shoot first and ask questions later, whereas they might have taken more prisoners. And I know because of some of the tricks that were played on Japanese playing dead and then doing some killing after that, springing up, some of the Marine infantry would use knives. I mean, they would stab to be sure they were dead. But there was no mutilation, which was a tragedy, and the whole war was a tragedy. And certainly the many Japanese friends I've had and the students I've had from Japan, they're different people than the military machine that was out there, and that was a tragic time. And I know there were some much worse cases that occurred on Iwo that I've read in the book by Bradley. But I think the description that's in that book, I don't necessarily want to repeat. Certainly wasn't a human kind of experience that one sergeant went through that was trapped in a cave and brutalized until dead. But certainly, I don't think that's really the way of the Japanese, but certainly that I know. But I think if that war had continued, it would have been a terribly brutal war. It would have made the European war almost nothing. The loss of life would have been horrendous. And whether you didn't like the atomic bomb or not, it saved probably 10 million people. So I look back on it that though I was not aware of the atomic bomb, I certainly, the dropping of the first one, as lethal as it was not as lethal as the firebombing of Tokyo. Tokyo probably took 150,000, burning that whole city. And whether it's an atomic bomb or whether it's a 38 or whether it's a 20 millimeter or whether it's a mortar, you all die. So the bigness isn't really the question in the end. It's what would have happened to maybe 2 million more American lives, which I think was a conservative estimate of what there would have been lost, and I think it probably would have reached 8 or 10 million in Japan, of the Japanese.
I agree with you completely. Okay, we're going to step back to the ball field, and then you're also going to...
Oh, that's right, the ball field.
You were also going to make a
Unrelated
comment about
topic.
President Roosevelt, I believe.
Oh, yeah,
Oh.
you were just leading into that.
Well, after the conclusion of the war on the operation on Guam, we settled into trying to work on the morale of the troops, and so we built a ball field and had a team, and unfortunately I was a shortstop in college and I became a pitcher because nobody else could get it across the plate straight. But that was fun. And then, of course, we got the sad news of President Roosevelt, and certainly everybody was shocked and saddened by that. But we had another job coming up, and that was Iwo Jima. So we did enjoy that time in between and training, and made our preparation for really going into the inner defense line of the Japanese Empire.
Just go right on into Iwo.
Okay. Well, the 3rd Division was reserved for the operation. So the 4th and the 5th Divisions were selected to go in, and the 3rd would stay afloat. And of course, this is an operation from a service standpoint. We would not have a field hospital ashore. We had at least 2 hospital ships directly off, so there were some small clinics or posts where people wounded could go through and directly out, which I think was very fortunate because the operation of Iwo was at a cold time, and the loss of life from shock, more than from some of the wounds, was heightened just by the cold. So everybody had spent their time in the South Pacific and Central Pacific where it was warm, and to go into the Bonin Islands, which Ewa was one of the sulfur islands, it was cold. And I think the loss of life was higher because of the weather. But from our standpoint, with binoculars, I saw we were alerted to the fact that the flag was going to go up in Suribachi, and I did see that. And they studied both landing areas, both the west and the east side. It's easy to be a Monday morning quarterback, but I think from a standpoint of the assaulting troops, a landing on the west side would have been less hazardous. They selected the east side primarily because the one small harbor was next to a cliff area. But the east side had heavy sand terraces anywhere from 4 feet high to 10 feet high, very soft. And Suribachi, of course, provided enfilade fire from one side, which was murderous on I think the 5th Division was there. The 4th Division went in on the other side, and it was enfilade fire. There was a tremendous cliff area which overlooked this so-called harbor. There wasn't much of a harbor. And so not only was there the sand terraces, but you had enfilade fire from both sides. The other side, and of course looking back, had a convex slope, much less sand, quite firm ground. In fact, when we left the island, we left on the west side and drove right down on it. Only enfilade fire would have come from the Suribachi. There was no promontory on the other side. Whether that would have provided less casualties, nobody knows. But that struck me afterwards, spending over 20 days on the island and walking around. We were offshore, and we could watch the fighting. On the second day, our 21st Marine Regiment was called in, but the surf was a little high, and they were delayed until the third day. And they went in and were put under charge of the 4th Marines initially. Then on that was February 19th, I think, on the D-Day, and I think on the 25th, the 9th Marines went in, and the service troops went in behind them. And then it reverted to 3rd Division control, and they were in the center. So the 4th was on the left, the 5th on the right, and the 3rd in the middle. And by the time we got in there, and the 9th were in there, and we got in there, we set up our main supply dump just below the airfield embankment, and it was a good place for that. And of course, we didn't have to set up the field hospital. They went right back. But the importance certainly of Iwo was that it was one of the spots of their inner defense line. There wasn't anything there. It was 670 miles from there to Tokyo and 700 miles approximately from the Marianas, were our B-29s. And of course, the reason they wanted it was so that they could put some P-51 long-range fighters on the island so that he could accompany. Because prior to that, the 29s had to go without fighter support and had to have heavy fuel and fewer bombs. First P-51s came in. It was pretty gusty, and I think about half of the planes kind of crash landed and coming in on that airfield one. And Certainly later I saw a couple of B-29s come in and make belly landings there, damaged. And I don't know what the total saving of lives, it must have been in the thousands of air crew lives that were saved and planes saved. And they did have the fighter protection, so it was important. But the cost was tremendous, pretty nearly 7,000. And fortunately for the service troops there, this was the easiest supply of all three, because it's a small island. The troops didn't vary their positions very much. It was very slow going to the end of the island. And certainly we didn't experience much but harassing fire in the service troops areas. They had these big 300 millimeter mortars that would shake the ground, and some artillery fire. But by then they were at the point that they weren't disclosing their positions because the Marines go right after them. And so actually, from a standpoint of being in the service troops, it was probably the safest island for me of the three. And it was certainly costly. But the choice of the east side was for supposedly the ease of supply. But as I look at it, I think the combat infantry troops have got to face the machine gun fire and heavy fire. I would put them first. But I was not a general at that time.
I've heard about and seen some film of Marines on Iwo Jima using landing mats to help the vehicles traffic that sandbank and some engineer preparation. Could you comment on that?
Yes. Yeah, they used a lot of that. They had to. It was almost impossible on the east side to go through that deep sand unless you had some kind of tracked vehicle. Motorized vehicles had a lot of trouble, and they did put down a lot of it, and we had some into our main supply dump area. But that again is where I thought the other side would have been a lot easier. But that's hindsight. And they did study the island with photographs and maps. But Suribachi, I think, put most of its sand out on the east side and not as much on the other side. Whether that would have made any difference, but certainly when we left that island on that side, didn't have to use any matting over there. It was pretty, I thought, quite solid ground.
Could you just describe that matting for us?
Mostly kind of interlocking metal matting, and this something that the pioneers put down and the engineers put down. And so as far as its lengths and hookup, I'm not really that acquainted with it. But there was a lot of it used on the east side. They had to.
All right. I've also heard there was some aerial resupply that occurred in the northern, as the troops pushed towards the other end of the island. Did you see any of that?
I don't recall, though I've read about it, that they did drop some up there, but it was fairly easy most of the time to get the supplies out to the troops. One of my jobs was to go to the division headquarters and find out where every unit was so that we can get the supplies there by motor transport. But that north end opposite of Suribachi was quite steep and it terraced and very rocky and very few scrub trees. And I know in meeting geologists from the University of Michigan who went to all the islands of the Pacific and wrote a book on the Fortress Islands of the Pacific, described that in great detail in 1920, and certainly the north end of the island was an extremely difficult area. But from our standpoint, that was not a supply that we provided. All of ours was on motor vehicle. But that was the first island in which we had pallets. On Bougainville and Guam, we had to carry every box. But we had the pallets. So that was kind of a new thing.
How'd that change things for you?
Well, it really helped in getting it to the dump initially. From then on, you almost have to go by box. But it did make unloading of large groups of supplies and stacking them, and that was pretty important. And I think there's a picture in that thing I did that shows these large stacks.
Yeah, lots of, yeah, some pretty good pictures of those as well. I also heard that on Iwo Jima they had desalination plants. You being in the service troops, you might have been involved in that or seen that in operation.
We saw that they had enough to really provide fresh water, but it was not under our
Can
jurisdiction.
you just talk for a minute about what it looked like?
No, I really not that acquainted, and I didn't really see them.
Okay, that's fair. A lot of, well, two other things. While you guys were still out in the floating reserve, I understood there were some Japanese air attacks the first couple of days. Did you observe any of that?
No. Me on Iwo.
Yeah.
No, I've read about that even in Bradley's book, and I don't remember. And we were far enough offshore. They said we were off 50 miles, but had excellent binoculars if we were off 50 miles. But I did not see, and we were offshore from D-Day on, and I don't recall, certainly were a lot of our planes dive bombing, and destroyers were particularly effective. They could go in real close and fire their 5-inchers. The big guns didn't seem to make that much difference, but they were dug in down 70 feet. It's the kind of defense that I think we would have run into in Japan, which I call a mole defense. It's like the Swiss Army. They're all underground. And certainly that changed the ratio. When they were doing banzai attacks and getting liquored up and making these attacks, we were killing we'd lose 1 to their 20. When we had Iwo Jima with this dug-in fortifications that they had, it was about 1 to 3. And that would have certainly have frightened me if we'd had to gone into Japan.
Yeah, I'm glad you didn't have to leave.
Oh, yes. Well, Peleliu was costly, and so was Okinawa, and they were digging in more. They weren't making the mistakes that they'd made earlier, that they could scare people.
In fact, that's one of the points that they make about the commander at Peleliu and the one at Iwo Jima, that they took their troops and said, you will not do banzai attacks. You will not commit harikiri. You are going to make the Americans pay.
Yeah, and they did. Paid heavily. But it was an awful war there. But fortunately for me, it was probably the easiest. And certainly my heart goes out to those who had to go in there on D-Day, because every inch was targeted, and it took an awful toll. And
What else about Iwo Jima stands out? You give us some great information.
well, I was with the troops that were left there for a few days to turn it over to Army units. And I did walk around quite a bit, climbed up on top of Suribachi and collected some rocks for my father, who was a geologist at Oregon, and so those rocks from Suribachi are there still, I imagine. I did not do a lot of investigating in the northern part of the island. There are still those deep caves, and there's still a few still there. And I had most of my points, and I was ready to go home. So I did not push my luck. The only thing that was quite different there than the other two operations, we had to light that thing all night. So they shot flares off the ships, or the fighter ships, cruisers and destroyers. So about every 10-15 minutes you had a big flare. So it was daylight most of the night, and which was quite different from the other islands. We didn't do any of that. But the way that they could come out of those deep caves, and they liked to go at night, it was one thing to control it. The only other experience I had there was that there was a Eugene pilot by the name of Curtis, and he took me up in a Black Widow P-61 night fighter. And that was pretty exciting because they were doing some practice, and those things would go as fast as the P-38s, but it's a much bigger airplane, and they would go in and track another aircraft. This was training, not Japanese planes. And that thing would just go clang, 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 clang when they had them locked in, and I sat just above the pilot, and then the operator was behind, and that was pretty exciting. And going down at several Gs, that was a great experience. But I don't know how much they used the night fighters, but they were there. But I don't recall them doing anything like the P-38s, and used to see those P-38s, particularly down Guadalcanal and Bougainville, and then the Corsairs. Those were great fighter aircrafts and exciting to watch. So I don't know what else. It was a small island, looked like a pork chop, and wasn't worth anything. But it was important to take it, but at an awful cost.
And videotape it, kind of summarize
Okay.
what you got back.
Well, I was notified when we were on Iwo that we'd had another promotion, so I made major. And so when we got back, we got the Oak Leaf clusters, and had a short time, and then got a chance to fly home in let's see, what was the bigger transport plane? P-54?
C-54.
C-54, yeah. Sat on a bucket seat. Took 2 days to, had to stop at Johnson Island to refuel. Then landed at Hawaii. Had 4 days at Hawaii, which was nice, and the only real hotel there was the Royal Hawaiian. Nothing else to block it out. And then I flew home, took 12 hours on Pan Am. And actually had some little beds you could sleep in. It took 12 hours. Now, what is it, about 4.5 or 5? And I landed at Treasure Island. And I was assigned at Depot Supplies, San Francisco. And would be going on out again for the assault on main island of Japan, but got married and then woke up to the atomic bomb. That was when I first discovered the atomic bomb. And that, of course, changed the whole outlook of the war. And so I stayed on until next April. Coached the San Francisco basketball team. In fact, one of my ball players, I understand, just passed away, and that was Thumb McGraw, the great Detroit all-pro tackle. He was a tremendous basketball player. And I know he was the athletic director at Colorado State, just passed away. But that was hard to keep a basketball team together because they kept getting out. If I'd had the ones I had at the start and had him at the end, it'd been a pretty good ball team. But we did win that region of the, and then I got out. I didn't want to stay in. Too much protocol and drinking, and I didn't think that was for me. So I eventually went to Michigan.